Welcome back, everyone. Now that we've finished having our first cut, where we got to get an introduction to all of the different key measures that we use to look at the overall macroeconomy, it's now time for us to begin our early or first introduction to Keynesian economics, and particularly to the Keynesian approach to the macroeconomy. As we go on through the quarter, we'll get introduced to other approaches to the macroeconomy and other ways in which economists have theories and debates about what the economy is doing and what we should do about government policy. Now, to remind you, the reason that Keynes did his theory was that he was trying to explain the Great Depression, and he was trying to explain recessions, especially to think about what we can do about it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to think about the business cycle. So the business cycle, as it is defined today, is essentially the idea that if we look at real GDP, our GDP, it doesn't just keep on going up. So an increase in real GDP is growth, but the way that actually happens is that if this is my over time, long term, like if I look at, say, a decade, 2 decades, 1990, 2000, 2010, so on, that it doesn't just have growth taking place as a sort of upward increase in your real GDP over time. Instead, the way it actually increases is a bit like this. So that if you look at real GDP, it goes up, it reaches a peak, and then it comes down, it reaches a trough, it goes up, and so on. So a lot of the focus on growth tends to be about the long run changes. But in the short run, the argument is that you can actually have ups and downs in the economy. Usually we define an entry into a recession or the downward turn is when you have 2 consecutive quarters of real GDP declining. Right? That's when we figure that we're entering a recession. And similarly, what we argue is that we begin to get out of a recession when you see 2 consecutive quarters of the real GDP beginning to go back up. Now, of course, the reality is that it isn't like a regular sound wave. It isn't so clear. And there are times when the depth of the recession can be very deep and it's hard to come out of it. There can be times when, as you see with the Great Recession, it can take quite a lot of time. So 2008, it took a long time for us to come out of that recession. And so those are the kinds of questions we have. And there's also going to be questions about structural change. When you come out of a recession, is it just like the economy looks exactly like it did before you left? Or have there been changes in institutions or in income distribution or other kinds of things that we have to start worrying about? But overall, the idea of the business cycle is that there's going to be periods when you see real GDP decline and periods when you'll come out of that. So Keynes' concern was often also thought of as short run, but those of you who've had neoclassical economics or microeconomics with me know that one of the big debates in economics is how long is the long run and how short is the short run. It's one thing if the main issue of a short run is 6 months, to a year. It's another thing if I'm talking about a long run, meaning 30 years, right? And that's not actually a functional way to think about the economy. So we are going to look at this. There's other things that are changing in this business cycle. We know that there have been times when during the boom period of the business cycle, when you're coming out of it and when you're really growing fast, that you tend to see inflation. We also know that during recessionary times, you either see a softening in inflation rates. During the height of the Great Depression, we actually had a drop in prices, which is really deflation, and that's actually a highly problematic thing. And then, every so often, because the causes of recessions and depressions and declines in your GDP, real GDP, can be diverse. We know in the 70s we experienced stagflation, the unusual situation when you both saw a drop in GDP and a rise in prices. So as we go through the quarter, we'll keep thinking about all these variations. But for now, we're going to hone in on the real GDP. And we're going to hone in on the question about what determines the level of real GDP. What determines the level of production, the overall level of production in the economy, right? We're going to bracket off questions of prices, and we're going to bracket off some of the other questions having to do with longer term growth, some of the other issues that we can think about as we go further through the quarter. And so we're just going to use our ceteris paribus hat for now, our idea that we're just going to hold other things constant and focus on this. So our aim, therefore, is going to be to come up with the Keynesian demand side theory of what sets real GDP. This is sometimes also called the aggregate income, and I'm going to use the symbol Y for income, and the reason is because the symbol I is going to end up being used for investment, gets used for investment, so it makes a lot more sense for me to use the symbol Y for aggregate income. Aggregate expenditure. So we sometimes call this the aggregate income, aggregate expenditure model, right? So that's the model we're going to learn about. Thank you.